What happens when a band releases an album that perfectly shows both its greatest strength and its biggest problem? That's exactly what happened with Double Trouble. On one side, you had a polished new studio songs aimed at breaking into the American market. On the other, you had a loud, chaotic live album that captured everything fans loved about Gillan in the first place. The result was one of the strangest albums of the new wave of British heavy metal era. It reached number 12 in the UK, introduced a future Iron Maiden guitarist, and featured some genuinely strong songs. But behind the scenes, the band was already beginning to crack. Ian Gillan would end up hating the final product so much that, according to rock legend, he threw his copy of the album out his car window after hearing the finished mix. Today we take a look at Double Trouble, how it came together, why it divided the band, and how it set the stage for Gillan's final chapter. By 1981, Gillan were riding high. Their previous album, Future Shock, had become their biggest commercial success. Songs like No Laughing in Heaven had expanded the band's audience without sacrificing too much of their hard rock identity. They had built a reputation as one of Britain's hardest working live bands, and it looked like even bigger things were ahead. Then everything changed almost overnight. Longtime guitarist Bernie Tormé suddenly quit the band in June 1981. The breaking point came when the band was scheduled to perform No Laughing in Heaven on BBC's Top of the Pops. Tormé refused to do it. Instead of compromising, he walked away from the band entirely. Losing your lead guitarist in the middle of a busy touring schedule could have been a disaster. Instead, Gillan moved incredibly quickly. They recruited Janick Gers, a young guitarist who had previously played with White Spirit. At the time, very few people knew his name, but years later he would become famous as one of Iron Maiden's longest-serving guitarists. Gers had almost no time to settle in. He joined the European tour almost immediately before heading into the studio with the rest of the band just weeks later. It was a trial by fire, but he proved he could handle the pressure. His arrival also brought a noticeable change in style. Where Bernie Tormé's playing had been wild and unpredictable, the heavily influenced punk energy, Gers approached the guitar with very much more precision. His solos were cleaner, more melodic, and technically controlled. That difference would become one of the defining characteristics of Double Trouble. One interesting thing about Gillan was how they actually wrote songs. Unlike many bands where the singer arrives with lyrics and melodies first, Gillan usually worked with the music outward. Janick Gers, bassist John McCoy, keyboard player Colin Towns, and drummer Mick Underwood would get together and jam on riffs, chord progressions, and arrangements. They built the musical framework first. Only after the instrumental tracks were taking shape would Ian Gillan step in. He would listen to the backing tracks and come up with vocal melodies and lyrics, often incredibly quickly. Gillan even joked in interviews that he frequently wrote the lyrics while sitting in the studio toilet. And as funny as that sounds, it seemed to work. His lyrics often felt spontaneous, strange, and energetic, matching the unpredictable personality that fans loved. Because Gers was still new to the band, his influence naturally leaned more towards structured songwriting. The music remained heavy, but there was a stronger sense of discipline compared to the raw chaos that Bernie Tormé had helped create in earlier albums. That shift wasn't accidental. Management had already started thinking bigger. In August 1981, the band entered Kingsway Recordings in London to begin recording the studio portion of Double Trouble. Sessions were produced by Steve Smith and engineered by Paul Chas Watkins. From the beginning, there was a clear goal. The band's management believed Gillan had a real opportunity to crack the American market. To make that happen, they wanted a cleaner, more commercial sound that would stand a better chance of receiving radio airplay in the United States. For a band that had built its reputation on raw power and live intensity, this represented a major change. The guitars became cleaner, the keyboards became more prominent, the production itself became tighter, smoother, and more polished than anything the band had released before. After recording was completed, the tracks were taken to Abbey Road Studios for mixing and final polishing. Not everyone was convinced that this was the right direction. Ian Gillan already had doubts about how slick everything was becoming. He loved bands that sounded dangerous and unpredictable, and he worried that too much studio polish would remove exactly what made Gillan special. Still, everyone pushed ahead, hoping the new direction would open doors internationally. Commercially, it wasn't a terrible gamble. The album would eventually climb to number 12 on the UK Albums Chart. Unfortunately, the gamble didn't pay off. Despite the effort to give Double Trouble a cleaner, more radio-friendly sound, the album failed to make any impact in the American market. In fact, it It wasn't even officially released in the United States at the time. American fans had to wait until 1990 before Double Trouble finally saw a US release on CD. So after sacrificing some of the raw edge in hopes of reaching a bigger audience, Gillan didn't get the American breakthrough they were aiming for. Unlike most double albums, Double Trouble wasn't filled with 2 discs of new material. Instead, the first record featured brand new studio songs, while the second would showcase the band's explosive live performances. The studio side opens with I'll Rip Your Spine Out. It immediately introduced listeners to the band's new lineup, fast, energetic, and full of momentum. I'll Rip Your Spine Out proved that Janick Gers could absolutely handle the job. His playing was fast and technical, but also remarkably clean. Rather than trying to imitate Bernie Tormé, Gers established his own identity from the very beginning. Next came Restless, which became the album's lead single. If management wanted a radio-friendly Gillan song, this was probably the closest they came. The song features a catchy groove, memorable chorus, polished production, and plenty of Colin Townsend's keyboard work. Janick Gers delivers a melodic solo that fits perfectly within the song's commercial approach, without sacrificing too much of the band's hard rock edge. It wasn't as wild as early Gillan material, but it showed the band could write accessible songs without completely abandoning their identity. Then there was Nightmare. Clocking at nearly 5 minutes, it became one of the album's more dramatic moments. Colin Townsend's keyboards create an eerie atmosphere before Ian Gillan gradually builds the tension with one of his most theatrical vocal performances. Instead of relying purely on speed, the song focuses on mood and dynamics, eventually exploding into a powerful chorus. It showed another side of the band's songwriting and hinted at how much Colin Townsend had become an important creative force within Gillan. The standout track is Men of War. One slows things down and leans to a heavier groove. John McCoy's bass and Mick Underwood's drums lock together to create a massive riff that drives the entire song forward. But as carefully constructed as the studio album was, it only told half the story. Instead of filling the second record with more studio songs, Gillan decided to show fans what they were really like on stage. Most of the live material came from the Reading Festival on August 29th, 1981. The recordings were captured using the famous Rolling Stones mobile studio, giving listeners a snapshot of Gillan performing in front of a huge festival crowd. It was also one of the first major recordings to feature Janick Gers as the band's new guitarist. One exception was If You Believe Me. That track had been recorded months earlier at London's Rainbow Theatre and featured Bernie Tormé before he left the band. It became his only appearance on Double Trouble, making the album something of a bridge between 2 different eras of Gillan. Listen to the live disc, one thing becomes immediately obvious. This is a completely different animal from the studio album. Performances are louder, guitars are rougher, drums hit harder. Audience becomes part of the experience instead of chasing perfect performances. The band embraces the little imperfections that make live rock music exciting. No Easy Way grows into a 10-minute jam, giving every musician room to improvise. Songs like No Laughing in Heaven and Mutually Assured Destruction explode with a kind of energy that simply couldn't be recreated inside a recording studio. If the studio album was carefully controlled, the live album felt completely alive. That's what makes Double Trouble such an interesting record. It almost feels like 2 separate albums packaged together. Studio side represents where management wanted Gillan to go. Songs are concise, polished, and aimed squarely at the commercial rock radio. Janick Gers' precise guitar fits perfectly with a cleaner production, while Colin Townsend's keyboards sit much higher in the mix than previous albums. The live side represents where many fans believe it truly belonged. Here the songs breathe, arrangements become longer, and musicians feed off each other's energy. Instead of sounding polished, everything feels unpredictable and exciting. The guitar playing tells different stories on the studio recordings. Gers establishes himself as a technical, melodic player with a clean style that contrasts sharply with Bernie Tormé's wild approach. On the live recordings, he's playing songs originally written around Tormé's chaotic style, giving them his own twist while trying to preserve the original spirit. Then with If You Believe Me, listeners actually got to hear Bernie himself, creating an unusual passing of the torch moment. On the same album, it's almost like Double Trouble documents one version of Gillan ending while another is just beginning. Now the next episode is going to be the next and ultimately final studio album, Magic. Unfortunately, by then, the cracks have become too large to repair. Internal tensions, constant touring, and disagreements over the band's future eventually brought Gillan to an end in 1982. So that's going to be next episode. In the meantime, check out this playlist, The Story of Deep Purple, including all the albums by Deep Purple and adjacent bands, the Ian Gillan Band, Gillan, Whitesnake, Rainbow, Select Black Sabbath, and eventually I'm right now in 1982. Once it gets to 1984, Deep Purple reunites, and I'll be talking mostly Deep Purple and Whitesnake just for the rest of the series. So that's all. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.